In the gypsum flats of southern New Mexico, in the dried bed of an ancient lake, there is a line of human footprints running for nearly a mile. They were left by someone young and light, moving fast, and for part of the distance that person was carrying a small child. The prints deepen and widen where the load was on the hip. In several places the child was set down on the ground, and small feet appear beside the large ones. Then they were picked up again, and the track goes on. Crossing that same line of prints are the tracks of a giant ground sloth and a mammoth. The mud they walked on has been dated to somewhere between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. That date is the problem, and it is why this story has been rewritten in the last few years. Because at that moment most of Canada was buried under ice sheets up to 2 miles thick, and the overland route into the continent was sealed shut. Somebody was already here. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our future documentaries. Thank you for your support. Now, let's continue. Start with the road, because the road was not a bridge. During the coldest part of the Ice Age, enough of the planet's water was locked into ice sheets that global sea level dropped by roughly 400 feet. The shallow sea between Siberia and Alaska drained, and what emerged was not a narrow crossing but a landmass, roughly 1,000 miles from north to south. Dry, cold, windy and treeless, but grassy and grazed by mammoth, horse, bison and reindeer. Nobody crossed it in a season. People lived on it. That distinction changes the whole picture. There was no moment of discovery, no first man stepping onto a new continent. There were generations of people living on grassland that happened to have Asia on one side and America on the other, hunting the same herds their parents had hunted, in a place that felt like home rather than like a corridor. Genetics indicates that the ancestors of Native Americans spent thousands of years isolated somewhere in that region, cut off from the populations of Asia behind them and blocked by ice from the continent ahead. They came out of that isolation as a distinct population, formed from 2 older groups, one that had already pushed deep into Arctic Siberia and one from further east in Asia. Thousands of years is dozens of generations. Children were born there, grew up there, had children there and died there, and none of them knew there was a continent on the other side of the ice. Living up there was possible because of a specific set of technologies. There is no wood on that landscape, or almost none. Fires were built with bone, which burns slowly and hot once it's lit, and with dried dung, and with animal fat. Shelters were framed with bone and tusk and covered with hide, and preparing enough heavy hide to roof a shelter is weeks of scraping, soaking, and working by hand. Fat mattered as much as meat. In extreme cold, a body burns an enormous number of calories simply staying warm, and lean meat alone will not cover it. People in the far north lived on fat, rendered it, stored it, and burned it in stone lamps for light through winters where the sun barely comes up. Above all, there was tailored clothing. Not a hide thrown over the shoulders, but layered garments cut to shape and stitched closed, with sleeves, hoods, and separate boots. The tool that makes that possible is the eyed needle, a sliver of bone or ivory ground fine and drilled through. Needles appear in the archaeological record of northern Eurasia well before anyone reached the Americas, and without them the far north is simply uninhabitable. Somebody, probably a great many somebodies, sat and sewed for thousands of hours so that other people could walk into a place that would otherwise kill them. The peopling of the Americas is usually told as a story about hunters. It's at least as much a story about needlework. Now, the route. The classic story has people coming down through an interior corridor that opened between 2 retreating ice sheets in Western Canada. That corridor did open, around 13,000 years ago, and people did use it. The problem is timing. Footprints in New Mexico predate it by many thousands of years. A site at the far end of Chile, more than 8,000 miles further on, holds the remains of a camp roughly 14,500 years old, with wooden stakes, hearths, and the remains of seaweed brought up from the coast. Other sites in Oregon, Idaho and Texas fall in the same window or earlier, and even once it existed, the corridor was not a highway. For centuries after the ice pulled back, it was a strip of meltwater lakes, raw gravel and mud, with almost nothing living in it. A person walking 1,000 miles up that gap would have starved. So there was another way in, and the most likely one is the coast. At the height of the Ice Age, the shoreline from Japan up around the North Pacific and down the western edge of North America was a continuous belt of ice-free pockets, islands, river mouths, and kelp forest. Kelp forest is one of the richest habitats on Earth. It holds fish, seals, sea otters, shellfish, seabirds, and it runs, with very little change in the resources it offers, for thousands of miles. A group living that way does not need to know where it is going. It needs a boat and it needs the next bay, and it never has to solve a new problem. The gear that works in one cove works in the next one, and the next, all the way down. That's why a coastal route can move people thousands of miles in a handful of generations, while an inland route stalls every time the environment changes. Boats leave almost nothing behind. Skin stretched over a wooden frame rots completely. But people had reached Australia by boat more than 50,000 years ago, so watercraft were far from new. And the strongest argument is simply the arithmetic of the distance. Walking from Alaska to southern Chile through unfamiliar country takes a very long time. Moving down a coastline where every camp looks like the last one is faster. The other problem is that most of that coast is now underwater. Sea level came back up 400 feet at the end of the Ice Age, and every beach camp along that route is now somewhere out on the continental shelf, under cold ocean, buried in sediment, which means the evidence for the most likely route into the Americas is largely unrecoverable, and probably always will be. What survives inland are the sites of people who moved up the rivers, away from the coast, and those are the ones being found. What the first arrivals walked into is hard to overstate. North and South America in that period held mammoths and mastodons, giant ground sloths the size of a car, armoured glyptodonts, camels, horses, short-faced bears standing 11 feet on their hind legs, dire wolves, saber-toothed cats and American lions, and none of those animals had ever seen a human being. Every animal in Africa and Eurasia had grown up alongside people and their ancestors for 1 million years and had learned as a species exactly how dangerous a small upright figure at 200 yards actually is. Those animals keep their distance by instinct. American animals had no such instinct. For a while, a hunting party could walk much closer than it ever could at home, and that gap in the animal's education would have lasted for centuries. It is one of the reasons the arrival of people on this continent hit its wildlife the way it did. The dogs came too. Dogs had already been living in human camps across northern Eurasia for thousands of years, and they crossed with the people who kept them, which means the arrival of humans on this continent was also the arrival of a second predator, one that hunts in packs and never stops watching. Some of the oldest individual dog graves anywhere in the world are in North America, dug into the earth thousands of years after that crossing, which says the animals were still being treated as members of the group. Then people spread, and they spread fast. By around 13,000 years ago, a distinctive stone point turns up across an enormous area of North America, from the Rocky Mountains to Florida. Long, thin and worked on both faces, with a channel struck up from the base so it could be seated into a split shaft and lashed tight. Making one is difficult, and the final strike that removes that channel breaks the piece if it goes wrong. After all the previous work is already done, it is one of the most recognisable tools ever made, and it appears almost everywhere within a few centuries. That is not a slow drift. That is a technology moving through a continent along networks of people who were already there and already talking to each other. And it took people to the ends of the map, down the spine of the Andes at altitudes where the air is thin enough to change the shape of a body over generations, into the Amazon, out onto the plains, up into the eastern woodlands, and eventually to the tip of South America, where groups ended up living on a cold, wet archipelago at the bottom of the world, going out in bark canoes and keeping fires burning on a bed of sand in the bottom of the boat. That last detail is worth pausing on. The people at the southern end of the Americas, as far from Siberia as it is possible to get on foot, were still carrying fire with them everywhere they went, the same way people had been doing for 1 million years, which raises the last question. How long did it take? If people were in New Mexico 21,000 years ago, and at the far end of Chile 14,500 years ago, then the occupation of 2 continents happened over a few thousand years at most, and possibly much faster. The mechanics of it are almost dull. A group that shifts its camp 20 miles a year, in no particular hurry, covers the distance from Alaska to Patagonia in well under 1,000 years. Add the ordinary reasons people move: a daughter marrying into a band further down the coast, a bad season, a dispute, better hunting reported from over the ridge, and the frontier moves on its own. Nobody was marching. Nobody was exploring. They were just living, and the edge of the inhabited world drifted south. The footprints in New Mexico are the most human thing in the whole story. They are not a monument and not a burial. They are somebody's afternoon, walking out and walking back, carrying a child on one hip in a hurry, along the edge of a lake, while a mammoth crossed behind them. By the time anyone in the Americas ground pigment and put an animal on a rock wall, their ancestors had already come a very long way,